Genesis. Is this the oldest creation myth in the world?
No, but some of it is based on the oldest creation myth in the world.
So what you're trying to tell me that the Genesis creation story is not like the actual first story of creation of man and the world and all of that?
Indeed, it isn't. So what we see is that Genesis has, well, I love Genesis. So for people who understand my work and see what I do, they may think I'm not a great fan of the Abrahamic faith. However, I do believe the Bible is an exceptionally interesting book, and Genesis is probably the best book within it. And I like it so much because it is a collection of the greatest myths. That's probably the best way I can describe it. So within the first 11 chapters of Genesis, so up into the Abrahamic stories, or the stories of Abraham, it basically collects some of the well-known myths in the region and in the world and places them in a particular way that actually really appeals to people. And I think that is one of the successes of Genesis. So we can maybe break those down if that's of interest to you.
Yeah, I'm going to be devil's advocate today because obviously I agree with you, but that's not enough, okay? I'm not so sure that you're right about this, that Genesis is actually borrowing from older creation stories. Can you prove that? Can you give me some evidence?
Where shall we start? So we can start with the very first line or two of Genesis, which is, I think it starts in the beginning. God basically swept. I think the world was void, and he swept across the deep. The wind swept across the. I don't know the exact words. So you're probably better at it than I am. So that is considered a synopsis of the Enuma Elish by most scholars. So with the deep referring to Tihom, which is cognate with Tiamat, the wind going over the surface of the deep, the wind being the magical power that Marduk used to defeat Tiamat. It's felt that, and the beginning of it, in the beginning, is actually probably better translated as the word when, and Enuma in Enuma Elish means when, and it's how the Enuma Elish starts, when. So it starts with gods already in existence. In a way, in fact, you haven't really created the cosmos. The cosmos is already there. So what we have is a story that when it's being told in the first couple of lines, many people at the time would have heard it and thought, oh, this sounds like the Enuma Elish. This is interesting. But what the authors of Genesis have done is they've placed this story in its own cosmos, so outside the Babylonian gods, away from them and into the Abrahamic God, this sort of superior, supreme God, and told their own version of the story. And what really captures people, I believe, and what made the Abrahamic religion different was they actually placed these myths in a canonical timeline, as it were, in a way that those myths can't be recycled by other religions and beliefs. So you find many cultures had gods that were recycled, such as Ishtar to Inanna to Aphrodite. We see particular gods get placed in different cultures' myths, but they're the same kind of god. But we don't see that in the Bible, and that's because how they've been quite clever with this, and they believe that's related to Egyptian mythology. So going back to your point, anyway, the first few lines of the Bible suggest it's a synopsis of another mythology straight away. And then on top of that, we see the creation of the world, and we see the creation of man, and there are actually a couple of versions of these within Genesis, and you should be familiar with that. So even though you're devil's advocate today, I think hopefully you can support me saying there are two versions of myths of like, for the creation of man. The first being, or let me talk about the cosmos first, isn't it? So once God says that there'll be light, he wills things into existence, and that is definitely a take on Egyptian mythology. So there was is it Ptah who I think was the Egyptian pharaoh or Egyptian deity that willed things into existence by the nature of the tongue. I think it was the translation of his words. So when he said something, it would come. And that's what we see. We see this initial Babylonian mythology work saying in the beginning. Then we see Egyptian mythology creating the world, and then man is created in God's image. Well, not actually in God's image. If you actually read it, it says in our image, wasn't it? So it suggests that there are multiple gods potentially creating Adam, and Adam doesn't actually mean a Christian name of a man. Adam actually means people, and they're not even given a sex of initially. I think it's genderless. And then the Bible then, or Genesis goes on to say, and it creates them in terms of man and woman, which is quite interesting because God doesn't do that for animals before that. And so what we see is this creation in that image tends to be, I would say, as I say, linked to Egyptian by how it's said and the like. And then what we see in the second part or next part of Genesis, where they create man again, and man is created out of clay. Whilst there is a story of man being created by clay in Egyptian mythology, it was via a potter's wheel, and it's quite late on in Egyptian mythology. That actual process is actually more well established within Babylonian mythology. So we actually see Genesis jumping between Egyptian and Babylonian mythology to create itself. And this isn't a surprise, because if people didn't realise this, then the Near East, where these stories are being told, is right next door to the Mesopotamian cities, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and so Babylon and the Sumerians. But also Egypt was pretty much ruling much of that landscape throughout much of the time, or the early time that the Bible was being written, or those stories we believe were being written. So that is why there is much influence there, and that is why we feel they are taking those stories. Now, there's even more evidence if you still want to play devil's advocate, Derek. So we have the Garden of Eden come along after that, when God creates man for the second time. And so with the Garden of Eden, God decides for some reason to plonk temptation right in the middle of it, or we assume it's in the middle of it, with the tree of knowledge, a tree of good and evil. And what happens here is very interesting indeed from a mythological point of view. We see that the snake in the garden persuades Eve to eat fruit from the tree of knowledge. And then Eve shares the fruit with Adam and he eats it. So Eve doesn't persuade Adam. Adam's willing to eat that fruit, and the fruit isn't an apple, it's just fruit. And then God comes along and thinks, oh, why, where are Adam and Eve? They're not naked anymore. You're wearing a fig leaf. You've been very bad. You've eaten from the tree of knowledge. I'm going to ban you from the Garden of Eden, and I'm going to take away your immortality, make you mortal, and you have to work for a living. Is that the right gist of it, if I remember rightly? And that is very interesting for two reasons. One, the fig leaf is a plant from the Semitic region. So we believe that part is actually original 100% Abrahamic religion founded. So at least there's a bit in the Bible that is original. But the part where the snake offers the fruit to Eve, and Eve eats it, and Adam eats it, and they understand sin, and they get chucked out the Garden of Eden, that is actually a myth about immortality. So what we see, and we have much evidence of this, is that man originally, so one of the very first myths probably, maybe even before the myth of creation, but it was certainly a very old myth, was about death, because man was really interested in why do we die. And we have burials dating back tens of thousands of years. So this was going on in our heads. And it is felt from our studies that the mythology of immortality was one of the first myths we had, which is that man thought he should be immortal, but he obviously lost that ability. And the stories go, there's two types of stories. There's one which is that an animal stole the immortality, and that animal is often the snake. And it's often considered the snake because the snake sheds its skin and is considered reborn. And so from that point of view, man feels that the snake stole it from him, and so now the man is mortal and the snake is immortal. But there is another version of the myth where that man is immortal and then he is tricked into receiving a gift. And by receiving that gift, which is often food, but sometimes it is knowledge of sex, then as part of that, his immortality is taken. And we see, and it's often done in an underhand way, so he wasn't aware that it was going to be taken. And so this loss of immortality, which is, I say, those two motifs are well established, that has actually been taken into Genesis, mixed together and then reflexed. And by that, I mean, it is no longer a myth about losing your immortality. It's a myth about sinning and the consequence of that, which is losing immortality. But they've kept the snake in there, they kept the gift in there, and they've kept the removal of immortality in there.
There's so much here to find. In fact, I'm turning off my devil's advocate for just a moment to mention Ronald Hendel, and in Joshua Bowen's book on the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, he, of course, highlights Hendel's work and other scholars who say that the Genesis myth is actually trying to demythologize in some way and kind of create a historical narrative in a way, but it's also anti-civilization. They do not want you building towers and buildings. They want you to be nomadic. They want you to be the wilderness dweller. And they're against kind of the narrative in the stories you're talking about from the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish and the Mesopotamian world. The Apkallu are bringing wisdom and knowledge as if beauty and warfare and agriculture and all that stuff was good and civilization is good, whereas it's a curse in a way. The knowledge of these things is actually kind of a curse on man. If I'm correctly understanding the story, which is immediately shown with you're going to have thorns and thistles and work your ass off and so it's kind of a reversal of what they wanted with Babylon. A
reflex, what we tend to call that in mythology. So, and you often find that with competing cultures. If a culture steals another culture's motifs, they may well reflex it. So it looks like their own motif. So basically they take someone's plot and reverse what happens in it. So, and we see that. So, and you're right. So when Adam and Eve are thrown out the Garden of Eden, I think God says you've got to now toil the land to survive, which is a sort of, as you say, a nod to the agricultural world. And if people don't realise, farming started in the Near East in terms of a significant part of people's lives about 12,000 years ago. And what we're finding is that there's actually, we start seeing conflict between agricultural traditions and those what we call hunter-gatherers or even pastoralists, so those who just farm animals and are nomadic. And that is really interesting because we actually see that in lots of mythology, but it isn't well shown. It's sort of hidden. And so you get this in the Vedas, so in Indian mythology, you get it in Nordic mythology. So Nordic mythology is probably better known, where you have the Aesir and the Vanir, which are two families of gods. And the Vanir are all gods that seem to be associated with agriculture and fertility. And the Aesir are gods that are focused on war. And it does seem like that the pastoral farmers of the Indo-Europeans have come across the early European farmers, so those are the people who migrated from the Near East into Europe about 8,000 years ago. They came across those and there was a conflict. Okay, and this conflict has resulted in these families of God, and so you get this in India, we see it in Hittite and also in a way in things like Greek, where you get the Olympians and the Titans. You see this sort of, there's this remnant of this big clash. And the thing is that what is odd about that is all these cultures wouldn't come up with this story separately. So it feels like there was a big clash somewhere, probably near the source of the Indo-Europeans, because it is their stories that tend to persist, certainly within the landscape I'm talking about. probably very early on, probably around the Caspian Pontiac steppe by the Black Sea, because we do know Near Eastern sort of early European farmers went up to there about 8,000 years ago, so 2,000 to 3,000 years before Indo-Europeans started becoming a culture. And so I'd imagine there was a big clash there that fed back to the whole region, not just Indo-European, but probably back into the Near East, to give this view of, there's a real conflict between the agricultural and the pastoral. And I don't think that is because of the way of life of these people in terms of, farming cows is better than farming fields. I think it's to do with the gods and the approach on doing that. And so you find the Europeans tended to be more aggressive based on, they migrated as young men rather than families, and Near Eastern people migrated as families. So the Near Eastern culture, as it moved, could sort of interbreed quite successfully within its own culture. But Indo-Europeans came along and they would have to steal wives from the Near Eastern cultures or hunter-gatherers cultures. So there was a real conflict of how they approached their diffusion and dispersal. And I think this is what you're getting at, and it was a significant thing, which is why we see it. I see it as a number of different motifs within the Bible, this sort of conflict, from Cain and Abel as well. You get a hint of this. And I think it is more associated with that than with, let's say, the Indo-European motif of the divine twin, which some people relate it to, or even the Indo-European creation myth, which often has a twin figure in it. I think it is to do more with cultural aspects rather than the class of people or the,
If I may, this is an important point, getting back to Bible as we're moving to the older myths that are behind it. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to unravel the onion, because the onion keeps going and going and going. And the stories passed on from other stories that mutate, but still have some remnants of maybe historical Sitzenleben in what the situation is, whether it be agricultural, hunter-gatherer, etc. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at Genesis. I see what seems to be an agricultural mythology, because it's a garden. It's a well-tended garden, in fact, because you have in Babylon, they had gardens, literally areas cut off only for the gods where mortals were not to eat. And this has been well documented. Academics have pointed out that they see that this garden narrative fits this Babylonian motif that we find in Mesopotamia. But you also can say Egypt was a heck of a place that produced a lot of agriculture as well, with the dying and rising deities, Isis and Osiris, the yearly grain, etc. And they were well known even into the Hellenistic era for really promoting and feeding the world, the known world at the time, from all the grain that they would produce. So there's a big agricultural aspect here. And are we to say that the Genesis narrative is working against that motif? Or are they kind of going along with it and seeing it as good? Or are they more like what you're kind of suggesting, pastoral? They're more like, look at Jacob, right? He's the good guy. Even though he lies, he deceives his father and receives the blessing. He was the good guy. His mother loved him. He puts on Esau's fur, makes it look like it's him. And he's like the chosen one. And what did he do? He sat at home on his butt and then checked out the local little sheep and cattle, while Esau was the hunter-gatherer. And he, the hunter-gatherer, is this bad guy, this brute, this idiot who gives his birthright over. Like, we see that motif playing, like you're saying, throughout the biblical narrative.
The Bible is definitely influenced through agricultural culture. That's without a doubt. We see, say, so many hints of it in terms of the toil and that. But I think, and so I don't think it's actually supporting the pastoral beliefs or the hunter-gatherer beliefs. But I do feel it's saying you shouldn't let the running of your farms and the farming of crops run your life. There's more to life than that. That's how I'm perceiving it, because it's always giving, this is hard work, there's reason to it, but also because they've said God is the supreme being, don't disobey him. Because if you disobey him, you get annoyed. So when Cain and Abel happen, which is another conflict here, and Cain murders Abel and then is cursed and cast out, God then decides to drown pretty much the world, which isn't a nice thing to do, but that's what it says. And that is very interesting because that myth, again, it was certainly not original in the Bible. And there's a plethora of flood myths within the Near East. You see those, the Epic of Gilgamesh is probably one of the most famous, but there were ones before that. But what we actually see is a very interesting motif within the flood myth. And that is where Noah uses a dove to get the olive branch. So Noah's been at sea for, I think, 40 days and 40 nights, releases a dove and one comes back with an olive branch. And he knows that, land is now available to find because that's why a tree suddenly grown and the dove was able to get an olive branch. But that actual motif, what we call the bird motif or the dove motif, is actually an evolution of a much, much older motif called the earth diver. And the earth diver is one of the, well, if not the oldest creation myth we know. So the question to ask is, why is the oldest creation myth we know suddenly evolved into one of the oldest flood myths we know? And that is because we see the flood myth originate in Southeast Asia about 30,000 years ago. And this is established through work in something called phylogenetics, which is a process of probabilistically modelling DNA, the dispersal of humans through via DNA analysis, archaeology, and studying the myths and motifs and their evolution. And putting all these layers together, you can come up with a probability of something happening at a particular point. And we look at hundreds of locations and follow myths and see which one is the most probable. So the flood myth to us probably started 30,000 years ago in Southeast Asia.
Where would that be for those who aren't aware? Like in modern
think of southern China, sort of Indonesia, around that area. Okay. So that's where flood myth. But the creation myth itself, we know, started in Africa with the earth diver. And what's happened is it's migrated into China or to Southeast Asia. But because many of the much of the population wasn't coastal based, and certainly when the myth started to flow up towards Siberia, which is considered northern China, you'll find that people changed the creation myth of a man diving in the sea to a flood myth because they didn't have any way to establish the sea as a benchmark for creation because they hadn't seen the sea. Many people hadn't seen it. So they considered, that if there's water, there must be a flood. And so this earth diver, and the earth diver motif, if I explain that to you, is often a figure, and more than not a bird, who at the start of creation is floating on the sea and then dives down to the bottom of the sea, grabs some mud and brings it to the surface of the sea. And that mud turns into land and magically expands. That's how land was created. And right. Then from there, a tree grows and people come from underground and up into the tree. And that's how people were created. And that's one of the early versions. And that tree will almost certainly become the tree of life, we know. That's a slightly different myth. So we get this earth diver bird, go down, grab mud, come back up. But the creation myth turns into a flood myth, and the earth diver of a bird going down and up becomes a bird that goes up and flies away and comes back. And he gets the olive branch. And then that myth and motif flows back from Southeast Asia into the Near East and comes part of a number of myths, including the Noah flood myth.
So is it just to make a point that we go from earth diver to flood because in these regions that may not experience ocean or sea or massive bodies of water, they may still experience floods. There might be creeks, rivers, or things like that. They're like seeing flood take place. Like in Mesopotamia, from what I understand, there was flooding that would occur. And I mean, it may not have been holy smokes drastic, even though there are some people who would say there are certain regions in time where there were some drastic floods, but it was gradual. It was still a flood. It may not have flowed in like instantaneously, like that movie 2012 as an apocalyptic event. but it was major enough to where they had to relocate. Things like that would happen. These are big impacts, and in their world, everything is done by the gods. You have to. That's what I was going to say earlier when you were talking about the gods are the ones who created. Let us make man in our image in the Bible. When people talk about, oh, I'm created beautifully in the image of God. No, why don't you say I'm beautifully created in the image of gods? Because it's more than one. And this is something that we've totally lost with our monotheistic defense. And it's anachronistic to really do that. So I love what you're doing. You're going back to the oldest earth diving myths. It brings the mud or the dirt from the bottom of the sea up. The tree grows and humans come out of the earth. We know Native Americans in America had something like this. Man came from underground. This is kind of a fossil, right, that we find within the Native American tradition. And we have an idea of how they came to be in the Americas. So they're still carrying this story. Getting back, though, to the story behind the story, Babylon's myths, Egyptian myths, and things like that. Where would you directly take? Let's talk a little bit more about the myths that influenced the Bible directly, and talk about the myths that influenced those myths, if we can.
So the floods happened in we say. So the Noah's flood is in effect the earliest creation myth we have, which has been evolved, and then after Noah, as all the gods basically drowned the world. After that, do we get to Tower of Babel next? I think
Tower of Babel, yeah,
Tower of Babel, which is now that is more interesting like that because that probably to me seem like it is influenced by the local region and the building of things like. Is it the ziggurats? I think they're called the ziggurat of Ur and Urduk. So I'd imagine that it to do that, but we do see various motifs of this where people come together. I mean, what's sort of slightly ironic about it for me in terms of God, that if God sees people build this building and everybody goes to the top, to say, look how powerful you are, and God curses them with multiple languages, what he's actually done is made them all split up into various cultures that then create their own gods and religions. So he's a big fail by God there on that one.
Well, you kind of see the failure even in the Genesis story, which I think is two stories threaded together, like the Genesis creation myth. But when we look at what you're saying there about Babel, it really is like, okay, why God seems to have kind of made a mistake even by creating man. He even says like, oh man, I shouldn't have done this, and we see that in the earlier Babylonian narratives where there's this idea where the gods are kind of like, dang it, the people that were working for us, these humans that we made to kind of slave labor for us so we can relax and rest from our labors, we shouldn't have wiped them out. I know they were annoying and didn't shut up, and they kept bickering and making all this noise, and we can't really sleep. But now we got to get back to work. This is not good. Actually, there's one that stays alive, and so there's the repopulating of humankind and such. But yeah, am I correct on that? Or the Babylonian influence is very much that humans were servants to the gods, where the Egyptian influence is that humans were superior to animals. And you see that in Genesis and the creation of humans, that I think it says that animals will be slaves to humans. And so that's very much Egyptian, but you then get this idea after, which seems to be far more influential or Sumerian influence into the Bible, that actually humans should actually regard God as being superior. And it's really quite interesting. So we find that humans' relationships with God of the Bible seem to be very different to other cultures. So in the Babylonian myth, for example, we get many demigods and heroes that can be again recycled in other cultures. You just don't get that. I mean, Adam and Eve were mortal, Cain and Abel mortal, Noah mortal. They were certainly trying to make a real difference between God and humans. And I think that is what we're trying to see, an establishment of that in the mythology before we go into the stories that were particularly about a single person, which was Abraham. And I think that's what the initial part of the Bible is trying to establish God as the supreme being. Now, just going back to the Enuma Elish, Marduk, and Tiamat, Quick question about that. Tiamat being this chaotic dragon sea creature. I mean, I imagine in the ancient world, if we didn't really have a modern taxonomy, we didn't know how to know what was, and we're swimming in the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, and I come across a giant manatee or a great white or some massive fish or something, an eel, whatever. I'm going to probably make it tenfold when I tell the story to my people about what I encountered.
I can tell you what happened. So, I mean, we actually know that the creatures in the Enuma Elish were pretty much based on water analogies. So we see the Tiamat being the sea and Apsu being freshwater, but we also see some of the children relating to the delta and the muddy water of Apsu flowing into Tiamat. So we get that. But you're absolutely right that when people saw creatures in the water, they often misperceive what they see, and that's not only because it's hard to perceive on sea how far things are away because there's no markers, but it's also because people look at like the wake of objects and consider the wake as part of the length of the object. So if there was a creature swimming on the surface and it left a 50-foot wake, they would assume, oh, that creature's 50 foot long. I mean, we see that in much folklore about sea monsters all the way through even to the 19th century, and then tales of large whales and sea serpents. Yeah, that's quite common.
And so Tiamat would be this mythological sea creature. And I kind of
see it isn't a creature because you actually see Tiamat change. So we see Tiamat in later versions of the Enuma Elish become a cow. And that again could either be influenced from Egypt, where you have Nut, who is the so it was represented as a cow type goddess, or it could have been even influenced from Indo-European pastoralists. So, saying because they had the cow as a very important creature, my thoughts are the initial source is probably Egypt for this one. But we do see, so if Tiamat's changing her shape, her inherent being, I don't think she was ever associated with a serpent or a creature like that. She was actually associated with almost like a personification of the sea, and you see that because when you go into Greek mythology, for example, we see a clear indication of that with Okeanos, who's one of the very first gods or primal god. Okeanos as Gaius, the sea, and then the earth. And so, why is he the primordial being? Well, they're still personifying the chaotic sea.
So, where do these stories come from? I mean, do you see any influence to the Mesopotamian Sumer mythologies? Because just to let people know, obviously you have Marduk, but Marduk's actually late. If we're looking at the bigger picture, if we're just backing up and seeing kind of a timeline of human history, all of this is really late in terms of human history. But but Marduk is later than the Anzu myth.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So Anzu was just before that with the bird. So, and that's a really great question, Derek. And it's a really complicated question because what we find is that within the Near East, we see this same kind of myth where there is this horrendous family feuding of incest and patricide and matricide and all sorts going on to create almost like a backstory to allow some sort of real tangible reason to have the deity in place that you are currently sort of worshipping. So, Marduk had this backstory of a number of gods, but you see that all the way through the Near East and into Anatolia and then into Greece. Because you find the Near Eastern farmers have migrated through the Near East, through Anatolia and into Greece, and they've taken those stories with it. But the problem is, it's really hard to establish what came first. And even in the Book of Kings, if you're familiar with that, which is a post-Islamic book, probably written about the 8th century CE, I think, I'm going to guess here, 5th, 6th and 7th Kings actually have a storyline that is, again, based on these earlier Near Eastern myths written 2,000 years before. So we're finding even just 1,300 years ago, this story was still being written in mythology. So, and we know the Greek version must have come after the Hittite version, and the Hittite version we know came from the Hurrian version, and the Hurrian version we know may have come from the Dunna. So there's a great there's a tablet in the British Museum, I think it's called the Mythology of Dunna, which is like another version of the Enuma Elish, but older. And he's talking about different figures at the top. So you've lost Thapsu and Tiamat, but you have Earth and someone else. But they all go through this process of establishing some kind of divine order where a son kills a father to marry the mother, to then marry the daughter, to have another son who then kills him, and then you get this. But why that started, that is the $1 million question. And the feel to me is that this is all to do with the personification of gods, and that came about due to farming and agricultural culture. So the biggest clue here for that is the storm god and the dragon. And there's some people believe Yahweh was a storm god, and it would make sense if in some ways he was, because the need for rain and the need for water with your farming crops is key. And so in our oldest myths of dragons wandered upon a already formed earth and gave it life. They created channels for water to flow. They woke up animals that were asleep under the ground, and they made it rain. But then,
now the channel is from its snake-like.
Yeah, that's one version. I mean, there are many versions, but certainly the Australian rain snake fits that. There's a snake story from Africa we see as well, one of the earliest ones that fits that. But then what you see is as agriculture steps in, a god has to kill the dragon to get it to give water to us. So, we see Vitra blocking waterways, and Indra has to kill Vitra. But you also get that with the serpent myths of the Near East as well. And so we see what we believe were probably spirit and animistic god-like figures in religion change into personified figures, and that's probably because communities started to be built, and if you're surrounding yourselves with a sort of a social construct, you want your gods to fit into that, because gods are created in the image of man. And so because you need a strong god that can fight a dragon, because the dragon is associated with water, and if it does that, then it will rain, and then our crops will grow, and you start getting these figures appear. So that's probably one of the key indicators where we see how religion changes, as I say, from animistic, so in effect a spiritual, or the world is alive. So, the water flows because there's a spirit in the water, and the moon moves because there's a spirit or a soul in the moon, and there's different ways of looking at it. It gets put into, actually, they're not spirits in those, there are gods doing that work, and the gods have been created because humans have gone from being hunter-gatherers to now living in communities, and the gods they're creating match how they live.
Okay, so there's so much to explore here, and I know we can get deep into this. I mean, I was thinking of Lotan and Leviathan and dragon creatures that we hear about a lot. You even have some in Greek mythology. There's a lot of stuff that we can dive into, but my final question to you would be, what reading recommendation is there a specific book you would say does one of the better jobs of getting people acquainted with the mythologies that precede and may even influence the biblical text?
There's no one book, because as we've gone through sort of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, there are sort of 5 or 6 mythologies, and you probably have only 5 or 6 books for those. In terms of best description of dragons, you probably Indo-European books are best to look at. So Bruce Lincoln, who's probably got a book called Death, War and Sacrifice that touches on a number of these motifs. There is a Lambert's book on the Babylonian creation myth, because not only does that touch on the Enuma Elish, but it also has the creation myth of Dunu in it, a translation plus others. That's very good, but there's nothing that really sort of ties it all together. Mm-hmm. That is a challenge. Again, Lincoln's he's got another book, Myth, Cosmos and Society, which talks about perhaps how you get these different, like agricultural versus pastoral farming as well. But at the end of the day, yeah, I think it's all down to academic papers and looking at those and understanding those. But that's one of the reasons I do this, and one of the reasons why I'm writing books that will hopefully be published in the next couple of years that will explain this, and there will be books out that puts all this together from a mythological perspective rather than a theological or biblically scholarly perspective.
I hope if you've enjoyed this video, you will go subscribe to Krakenford and stay tuned, because he's continuously blowing my mind, from the origins of wolves evolving with man and the myths that we have from antiquity on how dogs become domesticated from these wolves that we helped go together. And that's just one. I mean, there's so many. Snakes, oldest stories ever told, oldest mythologies ever told. You go deep, and I hope that people will come support you, follow, like your videos, subscribe to your channel, and do all the above. Anything else? Any final words you'd like to say?
None at all, apart from, please ask me questions. I look at all my comments, and I do try to create content for people. One of the things I am doing is I'm rewriting the Old Testament, and I hope to have that published by the end of the year. And I'm rewriting it in a way that will hopefully highlight many of God's greatest mistakes. So look out for that.
Ooh. Thank you so much, Krakenford, and I hope that you will subscribe to us. Check out the description for any details.